Chapter 4. The idea. There is a particularly tantalizing aspect to the building industry's strategy for getting things right in complex situations. It's that it gives people power. In response to risk, most authorities tend to centralize power and decision-making. That's usually what checklists are about, dictating instructions to the workers below to ensure they do things the way we want. Indeed, the first building checklist I saw, the construction schedule on the right-hand wall of O'Sullivan's conference room, was exactly that. It spelled out to the tiniest detail every critical step the tradesmen were expected to follow and when, which is logical if you're confronted with simple and routine problems. You want the forcing function. But the list on O'Sullivan's other wall revealed an entirely different philosophy about power and what should happen to it when you're confronted with complex, non-routine problems, such as what to do when a difficult, potentially dangerous, and unanticipated anomaly suddenly appears on the 14th floor of a 32-story skyscraper under construction. The philosophy is that you push the power of decision-making out to the periphery and away from the center. You give people the room to adapt, based on their experience and expertise. All you ask is that they talk to one another and take responsibility. That is what works. The strategy is unexpectedly democratic, and it has become standard nowadays, O'Sullivan told me, even in building inspections. The inspectors do not recompute the wind force calculations or decide whether the joints in a given building should be bolted or welded, he said. Determining whether a structure like Russia Wharf or my hospital's new wing is built to code and fit for occupancy involves more knowledge and complexity than any one inspector could possibly have. So although inspectors do what they can to oversee a building's construction, mostly they make certain the builders have the proper checks in place and then have them sign affidavits attesting that they themselves have ensured that the structure is up to code. Inspectors disperse the power and the responsibility. It makes sense, O'Sullivan said. The inspectors have more troubles with the safety of a two-room addition from a do-it-yourselfer than they do with projects like ours. So that's where they focus their efforts. Also, I suspect, at least some authorities have recognized that when they don't let go of authority they fail. We need look no further than what happened after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. At 6 a.m., on August 29, 2005, Katrina made landfall in Plaquemines Parish in New Orleans. The initial reports were falsely reassuring. With telephone lines, cell towers, and electrical power down, the usual sources of information were unavailable. By afternoon, the levees protecting the city had been breached. Much of New Orleans was underwater. The evidence was on television, but Michael Brown, the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, discounted it and told a press conference that the situation was largely under control. FEMA was relying on information from multiple sources, but only one lone agent was actually present in New Orleans. That agent had managed to get a Coast Guard helicopter ride over the city that first afternoon, and he filed an urgent report the only way he could with most communication lines cut by email. Flooding was widespread, the email said. He himself had seen bodies floating in the water and hundreds of people stranded on rooftops. Help was needed. But the government's top officials did not use email. And as a Senate hearing uncovered, they were not apprised of the contents of the message until the next day. By then, 80% of the city was flooded. 20,000 refugees were stranded at the New Orleans Superdome. Another 20,000 were at the Ernest N. Memorial Convention Center. Over 5,000 people were at an overpass on Interstate 10, some of them left by rescue crews and most carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. Hospitals were without power and suffering horrendous conditions. As people became desperate for food and water, looting began. Civil breakdown became a serious concern. Numerous local officials and impromptu organizers made efforts to contact authorities and let them know what was needed, but they too were unable to reach anyone. When they finally got a live person on the phone, they were told to wait. Their requests would have to be sent up the line. The traditional command and control system rapidly became overwhelmed. There were too many decisions to be made and too little information about precisely where and what help was needed. Nevertheless, the authorities refused to abandon the traditional model. For days, while conditions deteriorated hourly, arguments roared over who had the power to provide the resources and make decisions. The federal government wouldn't yield the power to the state government. The state government wouldn't give it to the local government. And no one would give it to people in the private sector. The result was a combination of anarchy and Orwellian bureaucracy with horrifying consequences. Trucks with water and food were halted or diverted or refused entry by authorities. The supplies were not part of their plan. Bus requisitions were held up for days. The official request did not even reach the U.S. Department of Transportation until 2 days after tens of thousands had become trapped and in need of evacuation. Meanwhile, 200 local transit buses were sitting idle on higher ground nearby. The trouble wasn't a lack of sympathy among top officials. It was a lack of understanding that, in the face of an extraordinarily complex problem, power needed to be pushed out of the center as far as possible. Everyone was waiting for the cavalry, but a centrally run, government-controlled solution was not going to be possible. Asked afterward to explain the disastrous failures, Michael Chertoff, Secretary of Homeland Security, said that it had been an ultra-catastrophe, a perfect storm that exceeded the foresight of the planners, and maybe anybody's foresight. But that's not an explanation. It's simply the definition of a complex situation. And such a situation requires a different kind of solution from the command and control paradigm officials relied on. Of all organizations, it was oddly enough Walmart that best recognized the complex nature of the circumstances, according to a case study from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Briefed on what was developing, the giant discount retailer's chief executive officer, Lee Scott, issued a simple edict. "This company will respond to the level of this disaster," he was remembered to have said in a meeting with his upper management. "A lot of you are going to have to make decisions above your level. Make the best decision that you can with the information that's available to you at the time, and, above all, do the right thing." As one of the officers at the meeting later recalled, that was it. The edict was passed down to store managers and set the tone for how people were expected to react. On the most immediate level, Walmart had 126 stores closed due to damage and power outages. 20,000 employees and their family members were displaced. The initial focus was on helping them. And within 48 hours, more than half of the damaged stores were up and running again. But according to one executive on the scene, as word of the disaster's impact on the city's population began filtering in from Walmart employees on the ground, the priority shifted from reopening stores to, "Oh, my God, what can we do to help these people?" Acting on their own authority, Walmart store managers began distributing diapers, water, baby formula, and ice to residents. Where FEMA still hadn't figured out how to requisition supplies, the managers fashioned crude paper slip credit systems for first responders, providing them with food, sleeping bags, toiletries, and also, where available, rescue equipment like hatchets, ropes, and boots. The assistant manager of a Walmart store engulfed by a 30-foot storm surge ran a bulldozer through the store, loaded it with any items she could salvage, and gave them all away in the parking lot. When a local hospital told her it was running short of drugs, she went back in and broke into the store's pharmacy and was lauded by upper management for it. Senior Walmart officials concentrated on setting goals, measuring progress, and maintaining communication lines with employees at the front lines and with official agencies when they could. In other words, to handle this complex situation, they did not issue instructions. Conditions were too unpredictable and constantly changing. They worked on making sure people talked. Walmart's emergency operations team even included a member of the Red Cross. The federal government declined Walmart's invitation to participate. The team also opened a 24-hour call center for employees, which started with 8 operators but rapidly expanded to 80 to cope with the load. Along the way, the team discovered that, given common goals to do what they could to help and to coordinate with one another, Walmart's employees were able to fashion some extraordinary solutions. They set up 3 temporary mobile pharmacies in the city and adopted a plan to provide medications for free at all of their stores for evacuees with emergency needs even without a prescription. They set up free check cashing for payroll and other checks in disaster area stores. They opened temporary clinics to provide emergency personnel with inoculations against floodborne illnesses. And most prominently, within just 2 days of Katrina's landfall, the company's logistics teams managed to contrive ways to get tractor-trailers with food, water, and emergency equipment past roadblocks and into the dying city. They were able to supply water and food to refugees and even to the National Guard a day before the government appeared on the scene. By the end, Walmart had sent in a total of 2,498 trailer loads of emergency supplies and donated $3.5 million in merchandise to area shelters and command centers. If the American government had responded like Walmart has responded, we wouldn't be in this crisis, Jefferson Parish's top official, Aaron Broussard, said in a network television interview at the time. The lesson of this tale has been misunderstood. Some have argued that the episode proves that the private sector is better than the public sector in handling complex situations. But it isn't. For every Walmart, you can find numerous examples of major New Orleans businesses that proved inadequately equipped to respond to the unfolding events, from the utility corporations, which struggled to get the telephone and electrical lines working, to the oil companies, which kept too little crude oil and refinery capacity on hand for major disruptions. Public officials could also claim some genuine successes. In the early days of the crisis, for example, the local police and firefighters, lacking adequate equipment, recruited an armada of Louisiana sportsmen with flat-bottom boats and orchestrated a breathtaking rescue of more than 62,000 people from the water, rooftops, and attics of the deluged city. No, the real lesson is that under conditions of true complexity where the knowledge required exceeds that of any individual and unpredictability reigns, efforts to dictate every step from the center will fail. people need room to act and adapt. Yet they cannot succeed as isolated individuals, either that is anarchy. Instead, they require a seemingly contradictory mix of freedom and expectation to coordinate, for example, and also to measure progress toward common goals. This was the understanding people in the skyscraper building industry had grasped. More remarkably, they had learned to codify that understanding into simple checklists. They had made the reliable management of complexity a routine. That routine requires balancing a number of virtues: freedom and discipline, craft and protocol, specialized ability and group collaboration. And for checklists to help achieve that balance, they have to take two almost opposing forms. They supply a set of checks to ensure the stupid but critical stuff is not overlooked, and they supply another set of checks to ensure people talk and coordinate and accept responsibility while nonetheless being left the power to manage the nuances and unpredictabilities the best they know how. I came away from Katrina and the builders with a kind of theory: under conditions of complexity, not only are checklists a help, they are required for success. There must always be room for judgment, but judgment aided and even enhanced by procedure. Having hit on this theory, I began to recognize checklists in odd corners everywhere in the hands of professional football coordinators, say, or on stage sets. Listening to the radio, I heard the story behind rocker David Lee Roth's notorious insistence that Van Halen's contracts with concert promoters contain a clause specifying that a bowl of M&Ms has to be provided backstage, but with every single brown candy removed, upon pain of forfeiture of the show, with full compensation to the band. And at least once, Van Halen followed through, peremptorily canceling a show in Colorado when Roth found some brown M&Ms in his dressing room. This turned out to be, however, not another example of the insane demands of power-mad celebrities but an ingenious ruse. As Roth explained in his memoir, Crazy from the Heat, Van Halen was the first band to take huge productions into tertiary, third-level markets. We'd pull up with 9 18-wheeler trucks, full of gear, where the standard was 3 trucks, max. And there were many technical errors, whether it was the girders couldn't support the weight, or the flooring would sink in, or the doors weren't big enough to move the gear through. The contract rider read like a version of the Chinese Yellow Pages because there was so much equipment, and so many human beings to make it function. So just as a little test, buried somewhere in the middle of the rider, would be Article 126, the No Brown M&Ms clause. When I would walk backstage, if I saw a brown M&M in that bowl, he wrote, well, we'd line check the entire production. Guaranteed you're going to arrive at a technical error. Guaranteed you'd run into a problem. These weren't trifles, the radio story pointed out. The mistakes could be life-threatening. In Colorado, the band found the local promoters had failed to read the weight requirements and the staging would have fallen through the arena floor. David Lee Roth had a checklist. I yelled at the radio. I ran my theory about the necessity of checklists by Jody Adams, the chef and owner of Rialto, one of my favorite restaurants in Boston. In the early 1990s, Food and Wine magazine named her one of America's 10 best new chefs, and in 1997 she won a James Beard Foundation Best Chef Award, which is the Oscar for food. Rialto is frequently mentioned on national best restaurant lists, most recently Esquire magazines. Her focus is on regional Italian cuisine, though with a distinctive take. Adams is self-taught. An anthropology major at Brown University, she never went to culinary school. But I had a thing for food, as she puts it, and she went to work in restaurants, learning her way from chopping onions to creating her own style of cooking. The level of skill and craft she has achieved in her restaurant is daunting. Moreover, she has sustained it for many years now. I was interested in how she did it. I understood perfectly well how the Burger Kings and Taco Bells of the world operate. They are driven by tightly prescribed protocol. They provide tailorized, assembly line food. But in great restaurants the food is ever evolving, refined, and individual. Nevertheless, they have to produce an extraordinary level of excellence day after day, year after year, for 100 to 300 people per night. I had my theory of how such perfectionism is accomplished, but was it true? Adams invited me in to see. I spent one Friday evening perched on a stool in Rialto's long and narrow kitchen amid the bustle, the shouting, the grill flaming on one side, the deep fryer sizzling on another. Adams and her staff served 150 people in 5 hours. That night, they made a roasted tomato soup with sweated onions and garlic, squid ink ravioli filled with a salt cod brandade on a bed of squash blossoms and lobster sauce, grilled bluefish with corn relish, heirloom tomatoes, and pickled peppers, slow roasted duck marinated in soy sauce, balsamic vinegar, mustard, rosemary, and garlic, and 36 other mouth-watering dishes. Sitting there, I saw remarkable expertise. Half of Adams's staff had been to culinary school. Few had less than a decade of experience. They each had a kitchen specialty. There was a pastry chef, baker, grill chef, fry cook, dessert chef, sous chef, sommelier. You get the picture. Through the years, they had perfected their technique. I couldn't fathom the subtleties of most of what they did. Though I am a surgeon, they wouldn't let me anywhere near their knives. J, the pasta chef, showed me how to heat butter properly and tell by sight when gnocchi were perfectly boiled. Adams showed me how much a pinch of salt really was. People celebrate the technique and creativity of cooking. Chefs are personalities today, and their daring culinary exploits are what make the television cooking shows so popular. But as I saw at Rialto, it's discipline uncelebrated and untelevised that keeps the kitchen clicking. And sure enough, checklists were at the center of that discipline. First there was the recipe, the most basic checklist of all. Every dish had one. The recipes were typed out, put in clear plastic sleeves, and placed at each station. Adams was religious about her staff's using them. Even for her, she said, following the recipe is essential to making food of consistent quality over time. Tacked to a bulletin board beside the dessert station was what Adams called her kitchen notes, emails to the staff of her brief observations about the food. The most recent was from 12:50 the previous night. Fritters, more herbs, more garlic. More punch, it said. Corn silk in corn. Creamed corn side on oval plates, not square. Mushrooms, more shallots, garlic, and marsala. Use the recipes. The staff didn't always love following the recipes. You make the creamed corn a few hundred times and you believe you have it down. But that's when things begin to slip, Adams said. The recipes themselves were not necessarily static. All the ones I saw had scribbled modifications in the margins, many of them improvements provided by staff. Sometimes there would be a wholesale revamp. One new dish they were serving was a split whole lobster in a cognac and fish broth reduction with little neck clams and chorizo. The dish is Adams's take on a famous Julia Child recipe. Before putting a dish on the menu, however, she always has the kitchen staff make a few test runs, and some problems emerged. Her recipe called for splitting a lobster and then sautéing it in olive oil. But the results proved too variable. Too often the lobster meat was either overcooked or undercooked. The sauce was also made to order, but it took too long for the 8 to 10 minute turnaround that customers expect. So she and two of her chefs re-engineered the dish. They decided to make the sauce in advance and parboil the lobster ahead of time, as well. On repeated test runs, the lobster came out perfectly. The recipe was rewritten. There was also a checklist for every customer. When an order was placed up front, it was printed out on a slip back in the kitchen. The ticket specified the dishes ordered, the table number, the seat number, any preferences required by the customer or noted in a database from previous visits, food allergies, for instance, or how the steak should be cooked, or whether this was a special occasion like a birthday or a visit from a VIP whom Adams needed to go out and say hello to. The sous chef, who serves as a kind of field officer for operations, read the tickets off as they came in. Fire mushrooms. Fire mousse. Lobo on hold. Steak very well done, no gluten, on hold. Fire meant cook it now. On hold meant it was a second course. Lobo was the lobster. The steak needed to be cooked all the way through and the customer had a gluten allergy. A readback was expected to confirm that the line cooks had heard the order right. Fire mushrooms. Fire mousse, said one. Lobo on hold, said the seafood cook. Steak very well done, no gluten, on hold, said the grill chef. As in the construction world, however, not everything could be anticipated and reduced to a recipe. And so Adams, too, had developed a communication checklist to ensure people recognized, and dealt with, unexpected problems as a team. At 5 o'clock, half an hour before opening, the staff holds what she calls the powwow. Everyone gathers in the kitchen for a quick check to discuss unanticipated issues and concerns the unpredictable. The night I was there, they reviewed the reservation count, 2 menu changes, how to fill in for a 6 staff member, and a Sweet 16 party with 20 girls who were delayed and going to arrive in the midst of the dinner rush. Everyone was given a chance to speak, and they made plans for what to do. Of course, this still couldn't guarantee everything would go right. There remained plenty of sources of uncertainty and imperfection. A soup might be plated too early and allowed to cool, a quail might have too little sauce, a striped base might come off the grill too dry. So Adams had one final check in place. Every plate had to be reviewed by either her or the sous chef before it left the kitchen for the dining room. They made sure the food looked the way it should, checked it against the order ticket, gave it a sniff or, with a clean spoon, maybe even a taste. I counted the dishes as they went by. At least 5% were sent back. This calamari has to be fried more, the sous chef told the fry cook. We want more of a golden brown. Later, I got to try some of the results. I had the fried olives, the grilled clams, the summer succotash, and a local farm green salad. I also had the lobster. The food was incredible. I left at midnight with my stomach full and my brain racing. Even here, in one of our most particularized and craft-driven enterprises in a way, Adams's cooking is more art than science. Checklists were required. Everywhere I looked, the evidence seemed to point to the same conclusion. There seemed no field or profession where checklists might not help. And that might even include my own.